From the far reaches of the Milky Way galaxy, it's Retro Nerd Girl with a film review for you. Today, I'll be reviewing the movie Silver Bullet, released in 1985, starring Gary Busey, Everett McGill, and Corey Haim, directed by Daniel Attias. The synopsis is: a small town of Tarker Mills has been stricken with a series of bizarre murders. However, it's a handicapped boy by the name of Marty who figures out that the murders are being committed by a werewolf, and it's up to him and his sister Jane and his uncle Red to stop the beast. The story Silver Bullet was adapted from the book or the novelette Cycle of the Werewolf, released in 1983. Before it was a book, comic book artist Bernie Wrightson approached Stephen King to collaborate on a fantastic idea to make a calendar containing Bernie's illustrations of a werewolf during the various full moons of each month, while featuring small vignettes from Stephen King. What a great idea! However, Stephen's publishing company required that it be reversed, a novel with the illustrations as a smaller feature. Each chapter a short story detailing a werewolf attacking a small town during the full moon of each month. Soon after the book's release, it became the focus of a film, and the title was changed to Silver Bullet to signify two things. Silver Bullet is the name of Marty's various motorized wheelchairs, and at the end of the film, Marty and Jane give up their silver necklaces to make a single silver bullet to kill the werewolf. Many people don't realize this, but Stephen King also wrote the screenplay with just a few areas where he gave actors permission to ad-lib. So much of what we hear of the dialogue and the series of events were his ideas. As much as I love the story, it doesn't always work. But when you think of the story in the mode of being a visual novel, it's very entertaining. Originally, Don Coscarelli was scheduled to direct, but left over creative differences with Dino De Laurentiis. Dino went with Daniel Attias to direct, and this was his first and only feature film. However, Daniel is most known for his award-winning work on TV shows like The Wire, The Sopranos, Entourage, The Americans, Homeland, and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. If you've read the book, you'll find that there are many differences from the film and the book to adjust to the platform, such as shortening the length of the story from a year to about 5 months, and many of the characters are more exaggerated and deliberate as to their symbolic meanings and significance to the story. There are several aspects to the story that are reminiscent to Jaws, released in 1975, where we have a monster that is terrorizing a small town out of nowhere. There's a scene where the father of a murdered victim angrily faces off with the sheriff, and it's eerily close to the scene in which Martin Brody is confronted by the mother of a victim of the shark in Jaws. Another similarity is that a group of vigilantes goes out to hunt the werewolf, just as they did in Jaws to go hunt the shark. And the main character's name in the story is Martin Brody, as I said before, in Jaws. And in this story, the little boy in the wheelchair, his name is Marty, and he's the main protagonist. Was it deliberate or was it a coincidence? Now the pacing at an hour and 35 minutes is not too long, actually, but it's somewhere in the middle of the film that you feel like it's struggling to figure out where it's going. If it's going to be a family film or a horror story. The challenge. There's a series of grisly murders that begin to crop up in the town, and anyone who comes close to finding out who the killer is becomes a victim. So the big reveal in the story is that the bad guy in the film is the local Reverend Lowe, who is in fact a werewolf. Now let's stop right there. I think that is a completely brilliant concept. And for me, the brilliance was that the character is not using the typical feeding frenzy trope that you would expect in a werewolf movie. The killings aren't as random as they may seem upon first viewing. As a human, the Reverend has to be tolerant of the townspeople, and yet internally, his judgment of them and their sins may have been harboring some deep latent anger and animosity that, that they weren't his ideal. And being the wolf really gives him the power to do what he believes is quote-unquote God's work. Now, if you just look at the first group of victims that he chooses, there's the drunk railroad worker, and then the promiscuous woman having a child out of wedlock, and also who is about to commit suicide. Then we have this really mean-spirited, heavy-drinking father who's very abusive. And last of all, the mischievous boy who stays out too late playing with his kite instead of going home when he should have. In this film, the werewolf never actually eats his victim, driving home that the wolf's hunger is actually the taste for killing itself. It's really important to know that, and that is why I absolutely love this story so much. There are two scenes where the werewolf actually uses a baseball bat to kill his victims. The bat the wolf uses is called the Peacemaker, in which he uses it to specifically use on the two people who have been the quote-unquote peacemakers in the town. The bar owner, who the bat originally belonged to keep his patrons from fighting one another, and the sheriff. A lot of people have said that the story loses a lot of its momentum for suspense when you actually know that the Reverend is the werewolf. But I don't think that this story is actually trying to get you to be convinced. You should not be aware of it. It's actually trying to show you more of what the Reverend is going through, so you can understand where he stands as a villain, like why he's doing what he's doing, and who he is as a character. I mean, he's fully fleshed out, and I really, that's what I guess I really love about this particular werewolf character that I don't think I've ever seen in another film. The way the character's been developed so, wonderfully here. As I said, the killings at first is a means for the Reverend to act out in the guise of doing God's work. However, the killings actually turn into a mode of protection from being caught when he actually goes on to kill people like the sheriff, and he turns his killings into revenge when he goes after Marty. But he's just embracing it, in a strange way. And then the Reverend, he's just pretty intimidating. His voice and the way he's very calculating and even just downright twisted. I just thought he was an amazing challenge in the film, and I absolutely loved this character. Now, the empathy. I had a great deal of empathy for the protagonist in the film. Marty is a handicapped boy who is like a normal kid, He has a good heart, and he may have some troubles getting along with his sister Jane, but he always tries to make it up to her. For example, when he's responsible for ripping her stockings, he musters up some money for her to buy some new ones. Now, they don't say if Marty's been paralyzed all of his life or something happened recently, but you see the longing in him to be physically like a normal kid, and it actually gets you to kind of care about him a little bit more. Marty is the first and only person to immediately assume that the killer is a werewolf. And of course, no one believes him, and the film plays upon the classic tale of the boy who cried wolf. Things really turn dangerous when Marty goes out into the woods one night to light firecrackers and meets a werewolf. During his confrontation with the werewolf, Marty shoots his rocket into the eye of the werewolf in order to get away. But then he tells his sister about this whole experience, and there's like this cool montage of Jane looking for a man or a woman with a missing eye. Now, when she discovers that it's actually the Reverend, Marty makes a stupid move by sending notes to the Reverend telling him that he should kill himself. Now, Marty should have left him alone, and the tension is high when the Reverend confronts him. Marty being handicapped really makes you feel for him, as he's really vulnerable in that wheelchair. And there's a deep sense of suspenseful danger as you see him trying to get away in this wheelchair. It's really heart-wrenching. You're just kind of like, oh my god, I hope you can get away from this crazy man. And then the relationship between Marty and Jane is really the area of empathy that really shines in the story. Like, she is actually the first person to actually believe Marty in the story, and she stands by him until the end. Now, Uncle Red is a little different. He's cynical, and he's a heavy drinking uncle with a heart of gold. He loves his family, and he really has a soft spot for Marty, because Marty reminds him a lot of himself when he was a kid. Marty and Jane tell him the story, but he only humors them because he kind of just feels really sorry for Marty. And he doesn't actually ever really believe the story until he actually sees the werewolf. And that look of surprise on his face is priceless. Now, the technical aspects. The technical aspects were probably the weakest link in the chain for this film. It took about 3 months to film, which is pretty fast. The special effects were both good and bad too. It's really kind of interesting. There's some amazing close-up shots of the werewolf's eyes that are pretty memorable. And you can't forget those scenes. They're really good. And the overall look of the werewolf really looked more like a bear, which might be off-putting if you were expecting to see something a little bit more wolfier looking. The look was actually based on the drawings of the werewolf in the novelette. And I personally thought it was kind of a nice choice to kind of match the look, because those were really great designs. So in the pre-production, the werewolf costume was modeled after a bear and even covered in actual bear hair. I believe that there was some discrepancy about the design of the werewolf though, because the producer Dino De Laurentiis believed that the werewolf would be a little bit more limber, and even hired an accomplished modern dancer to don the suit. However, Stephen King refused the changes to keep his artistic vision. So in many ways you can go with the look of the werewolf compared to all of the movies that came out before and around this time, and I think that the choice fit the story. Much like Jaws, we really don't get to see the werewolf in all of its glory until the very end of the film. Really, I enjoyed it. I thought it was unique, and it looked really big and really scary. Now, unfortunately, some of the other effects didn't always look great. Many of the transformation scenes of the werewolf and werewolves just did not work all the time. There's a scene where, you'll have one image that looks really, really terrible, like really awful, and then it was followed up by a really fantastic one, full of detail and realism. I don't know, maybe they ran out of money. But some of the gore effects were more comical and unrealistic. It just feels very dated. But everything else in the scenes really work well, like the music, the sound design, the suspense. The music was very eerie and disturbing, with lots of vibrating treble, rhythmic chimes, and looming springs of magical foreboding. I enjoyed that a lot. There were a couple of fun little jump scares if you're into that kind of thing, like a spider here and, tripping on a little mouse coming out or something. That was kind of playful and fun. And then the cinematography was absolutely excellent. I loved the work here. There were quite a few scenes with some very interesting angles and great storytelling scapes. So we come to the biggest problem with the technical aspect concerning both the editing and the continuity. The film clearly states that it's 1976, but there are so many 1980 references or things that are featured in the film that were invented much after 1976. Now the performances were great by some and overdone by a few others. And to be fair, some of the actors had a hard time being convincing because of some of the dialogue. It really didn't feel completely organic. Gary Busey as Uncle Red was great. He was just born to play this kind of character. He felt so in tune with it. And it's interesting because he was allowed to ad-lib some of his own dialogue, which is probably why he really shines in this role. In 1999, Gary Busey spoke about doing all of his own stunts in the film, where he was thrown around the room and thrown into some breakaway furniture. Talk about dedication and sacrifice, because many of those cuts that you see on Gary at the end of the film are actually real injuries. Everett McGill as the Reverend Lowe was impeccable. I just loved him in this role. His voice really fit the soothing idea of the Reverend, and doubly worked well when he had to portray a more sinister version of the character. Corey Haim as Marty was adorable and really shows the magic behind his talent as a child actor. He's believable, likable, and I really enjoyed his rapport with his co-stars. Megan Follows was great as Jane, and she's just an excellent actress all around. There were some complaints about actors overacting, and I didn't mind it so much. I thought that aspect was actually entertaining. But one actor that really stole the movie in his very, very few scenes was Conrad McLaurin playing Mac, the gunsmith. It was kind of the perfect performance to bring a strange, creepy vibe to make this whole story seem a lot bigger than what it was. There is something very interesting about his performance, and it works so well in that scene. Now, the best part of the film. There's so many memorable scenes for me, but one of my favorites is the dream sequence that everybody's totally confused about or just finds completely weird. I actually love that sequence. It took up to about 70 extras to pull off that scene with various levels of makeup and costume. And I'm not sure if you can say that pulls it off, but it's so weird and unusual, like dreams often are. My other favorite scene is when the Reverend Lowe chases and confronts Marty, as I had mentioned before. And he says, "You're gonna have a terrible accident, Marty. You're gonna fall in the river." It just cracks me up every time. I suppose it's the actor's voice and the tone that really chills the scene. And it's kind of like, oh gosh, he's in trouble now. Leading up to that moment, the Reverend, like I said, he was slowly walking towards Marty. And he's like actually lost control of his humanity at that point. That the animal is actually coming out during the daytime. He actually dares to commit murder in broad daylight without the guise of being the werewolf. I just love that depth there. I love that aspect. Last of all, I just love the connection between the siblings and the uncle and the whole family theme that was going on in the story. The ending is a happy one, and I'm totally fine with that. After, nearly having the whole town killed by the werewolf, I think a happy ending is in order here. My wish list. It would have been nice to have had the sheriff do some kind of investigative work, animal tracks, hairs or something, examining the bodies of the victim, finding claw marks in there. It would have been really given it a little bit more texture. And it seems as if that part was missing from the story. And since the story was from the novelette, it really revolves around the calendar and the cycle of the full moon. I kind of wish that was more of a feature in the film. My enjoyment. When the film was released in 1985, it was a bomb at the domestic box office with mixed reviews. It was successful internationally and mostly became a cult classic after appearing on television regularly. And when I looked at the complaints about the movie, I came to a very important conclusion. I think that for anyone who was introduced to the film through the television version, got a different perspective of the movie because it was edited for mass consumption. The way it was edited, it allowed the audience to focus on the story about the family and their connection with each other, and how this experience with the werewolf brings them together as a unit. Now, when this movie came out, I really didn't know that it was even in theaters or that it even existed. So the way I saw it was through late night TV appearances. And I always remember loving it every time it played on TV, and I could actually recite the dialogue of the characters. It was just one of my favorite films, even though it's really flawed. It just had a great heart behind it and such a great premise to it that I enjoyed. I completely understand the weirdness in the film, and it seemed to be something that was right up my alley. And I'm so very glad to revisit one of my all-time favorite films that I cherish and review it for you today. My rating is an 8.6. Well, that sums up my review. I hope you liked it. This is Retro Nerd Girl signing off. Take care, movie lovers. I'm off to my next review.